Здравейте, колеги. Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for coming to our session today. Yesterday, the university, in front of all our colleagues leading other research projects, we presented our project, which is entitled European Values and Social Challenges. Today is the session where we are not just reporting what we have been doing for a year, because the project started 1 year ago, but also we would like to show you, to talk to you, to present to you some of our findings, some of the critical challenges that we are exploring within our group. We should say that this is probably one of the most sensible projects we have ever had at the university. And that is something that all of us share. Because we are a research university, but up to this moment we didn't have substantial research funding. And what we were doing is mainly focused on teaching students. A substantial part of our work was research, but this project gives us the opportunity to form stable research teams so that we can achieve better results and the visibility of our work becomes better, not just here in the country, but also in Europe. We are very grateful to the opportunity given as a research university included in the funding of the Bulgarian Recovery and Resilience Fund, because this is how we get our funding for this project, mostly targeting innovation in various sciences. Our group is a multidisciplinary group, and we are aiming at doing interdisciplinary research. And you will see that in the groups that we'll be presenting today. The focus is on European values, and you will see a decomposition of this term from various aspects, from normative aspect, from political science aspect, from the perspective of psychology, of education policies. So I think this is very important because European values became so important now in political discourse, not just in political discourse. 3 days ago, I was coming back from a distant place, and while waiting for many hours at one of the airports, I just overheard, in a language that I can recognize, very close to our language, 3 young girls talking about European values. So I said probably when I open this discussion, I will start with this. So it's not just an issue that is very top in academic discourse, but I think people started talking a lot about values. My area and what I have been doing for quite a long time is European identity, but I think the discourse on European identity has been sort of overlapped now, or even replaced by the discourse of European values nowadays. So I think we are really at a situation when research in this area, interdisciplinary research, is very important. Okay, so with this, I would like to say, you know the program for today. We have gathered the two panels, and one panel is already here, taken their place, and just after the break, we will have another panel. I would like to thank all my colleagues who are here, willing to present to you, and I would also like to welcome all our guests who are here. Students, representatives of the education system, colleagues from abroad. I would like to mention here that we have colleagues from many parts of the world, Probably the most distant is Argentina, but we also have colleagues here from Portugal, from Poland, from Lithuania, and also our two, they are not guests, they are colleagues of ours with whom we are working very hard from the United Kingdom. I think I'm not missing anyone, and with this I would like to open the first panel, and I will give the floor to Professor Daniel Smilov, who will be moderating this panel, and probably you will present your colleagues that you have invited for this panel today.
Well, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure for me to moderate this panel. I'm Daniel Smilov. I'm Associate Professor at the Department of Political Science at the University of Sofia. And here at the panel, we have a group of very distinguished scholars, both from the Department of Law and my own Department of Political Science. We are going to present the findings of two of the streams in the research project that we have. One of the streams is called the resilience of democracy in multiple crises, and the other one focuses on constitutional polycrisis and constitutional imaginaries. Professor Martin Belov from the Law Department, he's going to speak more about the second stream of the research project. With us we have also Professor Svetoslav Malinov, who is specializing in political theory, and he will wrap up our discussion with a more theoretical view on the merits and demerits of classical ideologies such as conservatism and their relationship to the types of problems that we're going to discuss. Also, we have Mila Moshelova, who is a postdoctoral researcher, part of our team, and she's going to focus on aspects of radicalism, which is driven and incorporated in the programs of mainstream parties, which is a specific topic that of relevance to what we are going to say. And last but by no means least is with us is Associate Professor Milen Lyubenov, who is one of Bulgaria's primary experts on political parties, political systems, and he's going to speak and addresses issues of polarization and fragmentation of the party system, which is part of the story that we are going to discuss. My task here, apart from moderating and asking questions to the distinguished scholars, will be also to provide an introduction to the debate, at least as I see it. So it might not fit exactly with the views of my colleagues and their research, but at least I'll share my starting points and understandings in addressing the problems that we are discussing. The panel focuses on the resilience of democracy. And the link here with European values is pretty direct, because no matter how we interpret European values, the value of democracy and the value of constitutionalism, for that matter, is part of this package. And Eastern Europe was a good experimental laboratory in the 1990s for the following exercise. It was clear that the countries of Eastern Europe, they didn't have the same political culture as the countries of the West. Liberal democracy never had the same history and legacy in Eastern Europe as in the countries of Western Europe. So differences here in terms of political culture and historical legacy were particularly obvious. And this matters from the point of view of value analysis, because apparently not all of the values which have been internalized in the West had the same level of internalization in the eastern part. But Eastern Europe decided to take a shortcut, which I thought was a good policy for the time, transplanting ready-made institutions, institutions very much borrowed from successful Western models, implementing them in constitutional structures and constitutional norms, actually, which were quite robust. And even some of the models that were created, like the Hungarian model from the 1990s, they became almost exemplary. There were accolades, academic accolades of the successes of Hungarian constitutionalism in the 1990s through this instrument of borrowing and institutionalization. Well, the hope was that once you have this institutionalization and constitutionalization, when the institutional system starts to work, gradually the political culture is going to follow up and to emerge as a product of the procedures, institutional relationships that are created at the constitutional level. And we have to say, with the benefit of hindsight, that this didn't work as planned. So the idea was that the political culture will improve, and somehow the values of democracy and constitutionalism will become more and more entrenched in political discourse, in parties, in public attitudes, and so on and so forth. This was not the trajectory of Eastern Europe. So paradoxically, when the level of institutionalization reached, well, maximal degrees with the accession to the European Union, with accession to NATO and other structures, then some processes of disintegration in the party politics, in the political structure emerged. We started to speak about backsliding, about the rise of populism, all such type of developments which are connected with some sort of erosion and disintegration of beliefs, convictions in what we call European values, understood as values of democracy and constitutionalism. And even in exemplary situations like the Hungarian one, well, despite the successes of the 1990s, a political culture of very aggressive populism emerged, which started to question the fundamentals of what we can call European values. So Viktor Orban famously or infamously spoke of illiberal democracy. Some say that what we have in Hungary now is competitive authoritarianism, and so on and so forth. So there is this paradox. The question is why the transplantation of a robust institutional and constitutional structure didn't produce the expected political culture in terms of attitudes, both of politicians and the public at large. And partly we are going to explore different answers to this paradoxical question. We are going to, in our research, we explore the dynamics of the crisis that emerged. Professor Belov will speak about the different understandings of crisis of constitutionalism that we have. As I said, Associate Professor Milen Lyubenov, he's going to speak about the details in comparative perspective of the effects of fragmentation and polarization. And Mila Moshelova, also she's going to address these issues from the point of view of the adoption of some radical messages from mainstream parties. This is a kind of process which is important in my view. So the various aspects of the crisis situation that I was trying to describe are going to be discussed, and we do have research results on this issue. But by way of finishing my introduction, I'll offer one explanation, which comes out from my own research of this problem and paradox that I described. So there have been different theories explaining or trying to explain why we had this unsuccessful effect of transplantation in terms of generating the necessary political culture. And some of these theories relate to socioeconomic factors of explanation. So they say, well, issues like poverty, inequality, they undermined the general drive towards democracy and constitutionalism. But Eastern Europe is not a spectacularly good case or illustration of this, because the region as a whole has been extremely economically successful in the period. There has been a reduction of poverty, which is quite dramatic. And even in terms of inequality, it is very difficult to argue that these processes of erosion could be attributed and could be understood as explanatory factor in each and every country. Just to give you an example, in the region we have countries like the Czech Republic and Slovakia, which are among the most equal countries in the world. They have preserved the same level of inequality as during communism, which is quite remarkable. Bulgaria is not a good case because inequality here is quite dramatic in the following in the last years. But the processes that happen that I'm describing, they happen also in countries like Slovakia, which are spectacularly even and equal in comparative perspective. So obviously there is something in addition to socioeconomic explanations that we have to look for. Others have suggested cultural explanation, that there has been a conservative turn over the last 10 years or 20 years, both in the West and in the East. And this also could be an explanation. But again, when we look at the countries, we have countries like Bulgaria and the Czech Republic in which conservative attitudes, let's say, towards religion are not that widespread. So also I have particular reservations about fully endorsing the cultural explanation. What comes out from my research, and it's going to be published in a Routledge edited volume, which is comparative and addresses similar problems in other countries, including in the United States, is that possibly there is a third explanation, which is purely political explanation of the kind of the maladies of Eastern Europe. And it goes in the following way. So if you constitutionalize democratic politics too much, if you constitutionalize particular policies, and Bulgaria is a good example for that. For instance, we have a monetary board which fixes the level of the exchange rate of the Bulgarian left to the euro. We have very serious constraints coming from the European Union and the Eurozone because we are applying for becoming full members, and these are fiscal constraints in addition to monetary constraints. We have serious constraints coming from membership in NATO and so on and so forth. So when you add up all these together with anti-corruption monitoring on behalf of the European Commission, rule of law monitoring, and conditionalities linked to European funding, you get a very constrained political space in which the choice of policies actually is consciously constrained by instruments of constitutional or quasi-constitutional nature. Well, this gives stability, and in fact, Bulgaria has been a case of policy stability despite very extreme political turbulence over the last 3 years at least, we are heading towards 6 parliamentary elections for 3 years and a half, which is kind of a record. But despite this political turbulence, because of the institutionalization, constitutionalization of policy, we have policy stability. Well, this is good, but the lack of political choices leads to particular frustrations in party politics. Some political parties tend to become opportunistic. They say, if the system is so stable, so we might be a little bit irresponsible. We can push our advantage up to the possible. We could be egoistic. We could be not very. We could, for instance, go for another round of elections for no apparent or very good reasons. So this opportunism is one part of the constraining of politics. Another result of this constitutional constraining of politics is the tendency towards radicalization. Some political actors, they say, okay, we accept that we cannot change many things about the system because it is robust, but then we are going to opt out from the system as a whole. So they start to be campaigning for leaving NATO, the European Union, and so on and so forth. So we have opportunism and political opportunism and radicalism as political effects of party competition, actually. And this driver of specific political processes is, I'm arguing, relatively independent from socioeconomic factors and also from cultural factors. It could happen in places where you don't have socioeconomic pressures and in places where cultural pressures are not that prominent. So what I'm arguing for is to adding this other political factor to the explanation of the maladies of the political processes in Eastern Europe. I'm not saying that this is the exclusive factor. Of course, socioeconomic and cultural explanations do have a place, but this additional factor has an independent status, as I understand it. So, well, I'm sorry, I maybe spoke a little bit too much, well, I'm emotionally somehow involved in my own research, but now I'm not going to speak longer at the second round of questions. I'll give the floor now to the other participants, and we start with Professor Belov to enlighten us on constitutional polycrisis and constitutional imaginaries.
Thank you very much, Danny. It's quite a task that you're assigning to me to enlighten you about such a complex phenomenon so early in the morning. But anyway, good morning, everybody. It's a great pleasure for me to be with you and to share some of the results of my strand of the strand, so to say. Of course, I'll talk about substantial issues just to give you an outline of what we are doing actually in my part of the research. We are making 3 conferences devoted to crisis of representation, crisis of representative democracy. Also a conference on constitutional imaginaries of fear, and also we are going to discuss the future of democracy. We are having 2 lecture series, the one devoted to emergency constitutionalism, constitutional polycrisis, and their impact on the rule of law and democracy, and another one devoted to constitutional imaginaries. So today, for example, there is a lecture to which I would like to invite you, a public lecture of Francesco Palermo and me at 5:00 p.m. via Zoom, devoted to imaginary territories. And there is also a special issue which I'm going to publish with Web of Science. That's the important indexing system, Web of Science, in this journal, devoted to constitutional transitions in Central and Eastern Europe from imaginary perspective. And I would like to start in a reversed way, because actually Professor Smilov has invited me to talk about crisis. I'll say a few words about that, but I would like to start with transitions, because that's also something which is quite important, and I can try to build upon Daniel's argument here. I like to use complex terms as polycrisis, constitutional polycrisis, and constitutional polytransition. But I really believe that the doc is buried there, namely that we are facing not only a transition in singular, right, explained through economic, political, or party political perspectives, but we are facing a multitude of transitions which are overlapping actually and are producing a joint effect, both positive and negative, on our political, legal, and constitutional orders. And I would say the mainstream narrative about transitions has been so far based on two main paradigms borrowed from transitology used elsewhere, like Latin America or Africa or Asia, and applied to Central and Eastern Europe. The first paradigm is the paradigm center-periphery. So there was a strong belief that there is a clear center and clear periphery, and there is a package of countries which we label West and East Europe, and there is a monolithic transition towards something else. And the other I would say stigma was that the transition was one-dimensional from authoritarianism to democracy, and at the end there was supposed to be a happy end, right? Finishing with a degree of not only institutionalization but also stabilization of this transition. And that's why I think the term backsliding is quite inappropriate, because actually backsliding means that there is only one dimension of movement. Like it's like using a slate to play down on a ski slope, right? So it's up and down, up and down. And I strongly believe that there are a multitude of transitions, not only limited within this narrow paradigm, authoritarianism, democracy, but we witnessed numerous transitions. I'm just going to mention some of the most important of them, which we are currently researching with my team of international scholars, I have to say, very prominent one. There was a transition from what I call Westphalian to post-Westphalian, new Westphalian constitutionalism, from nationalism to globalism, and currently there is a visible tendency towards new regionalism. There is a transition from sovereignties to post-sovereignty society. There is a transition from territorial to post-territorial democracy. And I would say there are many other transitions, but there are two main factors or determinants which actually massively push our constitutional orders out of this zone of comfort allocated in this narrow understanding of democracy versus authoritarianism. And the game changers are globalization, of course, but this is a rather established phenomenon lasting for already if you ask Saskia Sassen, it started with the great discoveries, right? But lasting for at least 30, 40 years. And then the other very important game changer, and that's the most important game changer for me, is the ongoing technological revolution, right? Look what happened in the previous period when the Industrial Revolution and the invention of the steam engine, or the rediscovery of the steam engine, produced as a side effect a whole civilization, namely the constitutional democracy. And it was not democracy at the beginning, but the constitutional civilization, right? So the constitution and the civilization stemming from it was, to an extent, a side effect of this objective kick into modernity that was objectively predetermined, right? So now we are facing a much more complex technological revolution. Like a couple of years ago, it was the term algorithmic governance was invented, and previously it was big data. Now it's artificial intelligence, IT revolution, mobility revolution, bio-revolution, and so on and so forth. So we witness incredible, tremendous changes in the context, in the socio-legal context, that overburden is a very soft word, that make a huge blast to the known boundaries of the constitutional world that we have inherited from our forerunners. And Actually, I believe we are like, I mean, we, for example, the constitutional scholars, are a little bit like the medieval scholasts who try to explain the Industrial Revolution with the ideas of St. Augustine or somebody else, right? So that's why we had to make this decisive step into postmodernity and to try to look beyond the horizon of what we have inherited. That's what we try to do as part of my strand. And actually, part of this look into the future of constitutional democracy is strongly related to a concept or a trend of thought that is gaining momentum. It started like 10 years ago, but now it's gaining momentum, and this is the trend towards constitutional imaginaries, the exploration of how the collective conscious, subconscious, and unconscious, the law as imagination and law in imagination is shaping the way we understand, explain, and order our constitutional orders. And when you combine the massive challenges towards law in books, law in action, law in imagination, the polytransition, I didn't mention, for example, the transition towards post-modernity, post-truth. I didn't mention the trends towards post-humanism, which are quite visible. Modern constitutional orders are based on two important normative ideologies, and these are rationalism and humanism, and they are both in deep crisis. There are projects showing that rationalism was a non-successful or partially successful project, and we should not blame only Eastern Europe and the lack of this tradition. Also, the West is showing many signs of deconstruction and weakness of rationalism. Not to speak about humanism, which is challenged from multitude of perspectives. Animal law perspective, non-Western perspectives, internal critics, but also attempts at deconstruction from the viewpoint of artificial intelligence and the rights of robots, right? So each one of these phenomena that I have just mentioned is sufficient to produce a constitutional revolution and to open what Bruce Ackerman calls constitutional momentum. Few words about the crisis in the constitutional polycrisis. If you read Giorgio Agamben, Homo Sacer, the guy has clearly showed us that we, meaning the global West, but mostly Western Europe, were kind of lucky to live in an exceptional moment when there were no exceptional or emergency or crisis constitutionalism after World War II, because the pre-World War II world was usually governed through crisis and on the basis of emergency regimes. After 9/11, we witnessed multitude of new challenges to both political and constitutional orders. War on terror, financial crisis, migration crisis, pandemics. Now we can foresee many other crises. The ongoing hybrid war that can be defined as a mixture of Third World War if you're in Ukraine or Israel, and of Cold War if you're in Bulgaria or UK. We can expect maybe potentially a food crisis, a crisis produced by the artificial intelligence. There are many predictions about ecology and whether the world will collapse with regard to the ecological challenges to our systems. Which means that these crises came and didn't go away, and there was a snowball effect. There is a cumulative effect that actually pressurizes our constitutional orders in a massive way, in a multiple way, and that's what I call constitutional polycrisis. And this crisis is constitutional because it overburdens both the value aspect and the institutional aspect of our constitutional orders. And actually, I would say we are, like 10 years ago, there were moderately pessimistic predictions what will happen. For example, there was a discussion whether the clock of history is going backwards, to put it in the words of Umberto Eco. And there were some predictions where we are heading towards, backwards actually. whether we are experiencing a second post-World War, interwar period. I mean, where we witnessed the rise of authoritarianism. Because if you look at the period between World War I and II, actually there were almost no democracies in Europe, not to speak about the world. So some authors suggested that that's kind of natural spiral of time, and we shall pass through such period of re-emergence of different forms of authoritarianism. But we have the medicine, we have some immunity, we have the antibiotics, we'll use them at a certain point, we'll restore democracy as it should be. But in fact, I'm much more concerned, not to say extremely pessimistic, that this is the true dimension of history which we are living in. Because if you look again at emergencies and crises, all our constitutional systems were created in order to give response to very simple types of crises. They may be devastating, but simple from a constitutional viewpoint. Our constitutions were designed to work with wars, security challenges, internal and external, and natural disasters, such as floodings or something like that. Now, the fact that we have such complex and immense new forms of crisis actually overburdens massively our constitutional orders, and this makes fundamental principles such as rule of law and democracy absolutely dysfunctional. And look what happened just a couple of years ago in the times of the COVID-19 pandemics. There is a lot of research on how the emergency constitutionalism has deconstructed fundamental elements of rule of law, democracy, and separation of powers. I believe we have to start imagining, to use the imaginary terminology, to get ready to imagine a system beyond the traditional distinction of democracy, authoritarianism, supranational, national, human, post-human, and to look at the future that just became present, since the future has been cancelled and became part of our presence, and to try to imagine a constitutional design that might be capable to address not only crisis and transition, but also to cope with the new structural changes in the context. So we shall be maybe living in a society that shall be less rational, less human, less democratic, and if the future looks a future that may be dominated by what I call global algorithmic technocracy, we have to try to look whether we can save at least the core of constitutionalism, which for me is actually, and the main task of constitutionalism is, that should be saved, is to provide for fundamental freedom and basic equality, right? That should allow for preservation of these value core of our constitutional orders. So this is just a very brief, very sketchy overview, a kind of teaser to what we are doing with my colleagues from various European universities. And I'm very grateful also to Professor Stoicheva for inviting me to participate in that project, and to the sponsors and to my colleagues. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. It's not a very cheerful view of the future of democracy, but there you go. Now we turn to Associate Professor Milen Lyubenov for, well, coming back to the present. So your view is a little bit more forward-looking, and discussing some particular tendencies and trends in inter-party competition. Well, you have the floor.
I will present a topic concerning fragmentation and polarization of European party systems. In the last 20 years, many new parties have been created. Electoral volatility is growing, even in Western democracies. France set a record of 44% of electoral volatility in the 2017 parliamentary elections, rivaling even Bulgaria, which reached 47% electoral volatility twice in the last 23 years. Some political scientists explain the rise of new parties because of migration, Europeanization, economic transformation. But I think that along with the new cleavages, a much more important factor is increased variety of resources that can be used to create political parties. In the past, political parties rely primarily on citizen mobilization, building their organization from the bottom up. Today, many of the new parties are created by political entrepreneurs who rely on their personal charisma, money, television, and social media. mass media and television have replaced political party as the primary sources of information and instruments for political socialization, articulation, and aggregation. Many media figures entered politics, becoming political actors thanks to television and social media. Paul Gerbaldo even introduced a new typology, distinguished the new digital parties from their predecessors. One of the effects of social media is the segmentation and polarization of the public sphere. The mass public that was mobilized by mainstream media is now fragmented in many often competing niche audiences built by new social platforms. This leads to the formation of so-called echo chambers where you hear what you want to hear, but you don't hear others. Let's call this a segmentation effect. New parties initially radicalize political discourse because they try to articulate issues that mainstream party neglect, but which may be important to certain audience. Let's see what happened to the new political contenders defined as anti-system parties. I will briefly present the development of two populist parties that polarize the party system in their initial electoral breakthrough. But after entering the government, they change their behavior. Let's call this an effect of the system. The first case, Syriza. Syriza won the election in 2015 on the wave of populism that swept Greece after a severe debt crisis that drove the country into virtual bankruptcy. Alexis Tsipras promised to defend Greece's interest in settling the debt problem. The government, led by him, insisted on writing off part of the debt. After fruitless negotiations, Tsipras scheduled a consultative referendum in which the Greeks had to decide whether to support the agreement with the Troika or not. 61% of the Greeks said no to the agreement. However, Tsipras signed the agreement 5 days later. Gradual economic stabilization was achieved as a result of unpopular reforms undertaken by the government. The Tsipras government reached an agreement with Macedonia that opened the country's path to NATO. All these political actions showed the ability of the initially populist formation to adapt and acquire fully systemic features. The party continues to be second political forces and the main opposition party. The second case, Brothers of Italy. Brothers of Italy won the last year's parliamentary elections and party leader Giorgia Meloni became prime minister. But fears that a successor party of the new fascist Italian social movement would head the Italian government were unfounded. Meloni displays a pragmatic leadership style. The government supports Ukraine and provides military aid to the country. Meloni has softened some of his anti-immigrants position. She was well received by other European leaders and even received an informal proposal to join the European People's Party. And finally, some concluding remarks. Usually, fragmentations lead to greater unpredictability and instability if we refer to the experience of consensus democracies such as the Netherlands or Belgium, for example, which have always had fragmented party system. We will see that fragmentation forces parties to cooperate. And despite periodic crises in finding a successful government formula, a way to reach consensus is always found. Thank you.
Okay, thanks Milen for this perspective. we'll come back to that. Now we move to Mila Moshelova for her take on elements of radical parties' messages infiltrating the agenda of mainstream parties. Well, please.
Thank you, and hello to everyone. I'm really happy that I can continue the discussion from here because Associate Professor Milen Lyubenov gave a very good and in-depth insight into the mainstreaming of the radical right, which is a problem that we've been sort of seeing across Europe, regardless of the differences we have between East and West, of course, with different degrees. But my point of departure is slightly different. I look at the radicalization of the mainstream, or what happens when to those already in the system when we have these so-called radical right or far right actors. And because we mentioned neglect, and the reason why we see a lot of populist radical right parties rise is because indeed many mainstream parties neglect issues that are just contentious and hard to address, but they come to a point where they can no longer ignore these topics, especially when the radical right is gaining momentum. And the thing that interests me the most is the influence of radical right beyond elections, because in many countries, even though they may score, like in the UK, they're not really contenders for power, so they don't really threaten those in power in the same way they can in a more multi-party system like we see in Bulgaria, for example. So my research paradigm is this, the radicalization of the mainstream, and then knowing that the agenda of the radical right has reached the mainstream, what can the other parties do? So I think the most sort of close to real life metaphor I can give to the situation is if you have a very disturbing and loud neighbor that you kind of have to live with, but let's say that they have the opposite sleeping cycle to yours, and they're really loud when you're quiet, when you need peace and quiet, and then you are doing your things when they need peace and quiet. And what do? Do you ignore them? Do you try to be loud when they can tolerate it? So do you comply with them? Or you offer some sort of an alternative to the situation. So broadly speaking, these are the strategies that mainstream parties can employ when they have a contender from the so-called radical right. And whether they co-opt the agenda, whether they give an alternative, or they enter a conflict, has different calculations for their own projections and desire to be in politics, whether it's votes, whether it's seats and power, whether it's coalition building and so on, or policies. But it also impacts how the radical right is faring in the field as well. So if the hypothesis is this, that there is a threat, there's a reaction needed, and what are the possibilities or the outcomes of this reaction? The biggest threat perhaps for party systems and inter-party dynamics and inter-party competition, as we mentioned, is the change of the composition of the party system, because if the dynamics move away from the center in each direction, this impacts all the policies and all the general political direction the system wants to go into, and this is where the values we talk about are concerned. And when we talk about radical right and mainstream, what are... See, the noise is always there in the background, one way or another. Yeah. So just to give a very brief and overview or a definition of these values, I look at the values of political liberalism as basic for the European Union as well as Europe as a concept. These are the rule of law, fundamental rights, and separation of power. What makes them different is that they are a set of values that you have to comply with if you want to be part of the community. And how do they spread? They spread through cooperation, integration, and accession, of course. So given that we have so many challenges ahead in Europe, and just to give a very brief overview of those as well, we've seen obviously nationalism, which runs counter to some of the values of the European Union, but we also have foreign policy challenges coming from China and India, and of course Russia. There are projections that the EU's GDP is going to continue to fall as a fraction of the world GDP. The population aging is a trend that we are no longer able to overturn, but at the same time we have obviously the migration nuances that challenge both our needs but also our values. So given this, the radical right continues to pose a threat or a challenge to European values. And then looking at the role and the scale it plays on a national level, which is what I looked at my PhD project. I made a comparison between Bulgaria and the UK, the extent to which mainstream parties react to radical right and what is the result. I decided that this is also a good opportunity to look at how these dynamics play on the European level, or when it comes to European Parliament families. They're largely ideological in their composure, but also not only sometimes. So what I want to do is look at this, the question, how solid are these boundaries between the parties on the European level when it comes to this choice of strategies, whether it's the party positioning that drives the ideology or the ideology drives the party positioning when you have such a challenger on one side. And then the fragmentation that we mentioned, does it lead to more or less cooperation? It should, for the sake of democracy, lead to more cooperation, but how does this change behavior and the value compass of the European Parliament, and essentially whether this shifts the center of gravity. So the three main levels of analysis that I find curious in this direction are the policies of the parties, their discourse, and essentially how do these two play out when we look at the party system and the larger dynamic. And the main examples I can give so far, I'm part of the project from more recently, but anyway, when we look at the European Parliament campaign, which is weirdly starting very late, because you would expect that we know the problems, we know the challenges, and we would already be observing more campaign activities on both national and European parties, but either way, looking at what the EPP and the Social Democrats are doing after Brexit, they lost some of their positions in the parliament. We see that they have no choice but to talk about migration, security, the Green Deal, agriculture and farmers and so on. And some of their approaches include co-opting or borrowing the words, to say most simplistically, the words of the radical right, but also the frames they use. Who are the people? Who is the business? What is the interest? And so on. So my task here is to look at the degree of convergence these mainstream parties have vis-a-vis the radical right, which is split in two party families currently in the European Parliament, and whether this leads to more legitimization of the radical right, or it actually helps overcome the challenge they pose both electorally, but also to the values compass that we're discussing. And with this, I say thank you, and I look forward to a discussion.
Well, thanks, Mila. And now we move to Professor Malinov. Well, he's going to speak about mainstream ideologies and how are they affected by all these different types of crises that we've been discussing. So please.
Well, thank you, Danielle. No one can talk about this the way you said. Mainstream ideologies are such a huge concept. But there is a very good coincidence with what Ms. Moshelova just talked about. You will see the connection if you have listened to her carefully and if you listen to me carefully. You will find our wonderful continuity. And it's really interesting because I have never talked to her and I haven't talked about my research with my colleagues because I'm working on conservatism and on the level of political theory, and it is only a lonely thing to do. But I stepped down from the heights of my theoretical research, and I focused on something that has always worried me for the last decade. This is the the rise of what has been just called the far right or radical right. Well, I don't think this is a far right or radical right. I think this is conservative populism. But let me just say a few words before introducing my main thesis. We're talking about the crisis. Actually, we should probably be aware that we are part of a very noble tradition It's European culture is obsessed with the idea of crisis. This is a permanent topic. It started at least 120 years ago with a number of books that discuss the crisis of European sciences, the crisis of European philosophy, this is Edmund Husserl, the crisis of parliamentary democracy, the decline of the West. So I have a very simple explanation. While we are talking about crisis, we shouldn't be really worried because we are in a permanent crisis. And European Union, as far as I remember being a member of European Parliament for 2 terms, has been in crisis all along. Maybe there was a couple of months, one summer, when there was not a crisis. So European Union is in permanent crisis, get used to it. Maybe because there are so many people like us, we want to, you know, explain what we are doing, and I can't find a better explanation that than that we are in crisis, and we, the scientists, are going to offer a solution, give us some finance. So, permanent crisis, okay, we are talking about crisis. We are going to talk about crisis in the next decades. The whole point is that there are different levels, and I'm going to talk about a fragment of what we call political crisis, about the rise of the far right, which the concept, of course, I will reformulate in a few moments. I have to explain what populism is. Actually, I'm not going to explain. I will just tell you what populism is for me. I know that this is a very long debate. It has started probably 20 years ago or 10 years ago, but now, actually, I don't know a political scientist who hasn't written about populism. Or we can say it as a rule. If he hasn't written about populism, he's not a real political scientist in the last 10 years. Even I have written about populism. But I've written about populism before populism, I mean 20 years ago, which is very different, how I came across this topic. So for me, populism is a political discourse rather than a fully fledged articulated ideology, loosely connected set of ideas, attitudes, socialized and politicized emotions. It's a form of political thinking and rhetoric. And at the core of populism, according to this theory, is appeal to the people against the established structures of power and dominant ideas. So there are 3 things that populism is not, according to this understanding, and they're very important for my main argument. Populism is not ideology, according to this understanding. Populism is not exclusively left or right. It can be left or right depending on how you define the concept of the people. And here I come to my major concept. One of the most powerful resources of some forms of populism is the past. Memory is used to legitimize populist claims and delegitimize complexities encountered in the present. This is what I call conservative populism. I'm not going to explain what conservatism is because this is my main research, that I'm competent enough not to try in public to define conservatism. I will just tell you that it has something to do with heritage, past, continuity, and Edmund Burke. That's enough. That's enough. By the way, I'm going to publish, hopefully, an article with the title, Is Edmund Burke Still the First Conservative? And I'm actually to say, yes, he is. Bearing in mind that there are 20 years of attempts to make a revision of that topic, actually to say that Edmund Burke is the first conservative is quite bold and new at the moment, which is very bizarre. But actually, I'm just staying on this position. I know when there is a full circle, I will be again original, although I haven't said anything new. So that's exactly what I'm going to do, and we'll see if this will be appreciated internationally. But let me go back to what I just said. So I talk about conservative populism, which is labeled, this particular brand, by many scholars as far right or radical right. And it is about nation, identity, culture, heritage, and territory. And all these concepts are conflated and made, I will use the word isomorphic, which means that they have to converge, to coincide. Isomorphic in this populist conservative discourse. People are fixed in place by their cultural belonging and heritage. So the most successful, and this is actually a recipe for political success, the most successful among these populists today will be the conservative populists who can combine the rhetoric of citizens' resentment towards elite with accusation of a cultural decline, leaving the traditions, and of course, with the accusation against a liberal elite that has made possible these liberal immigration policies. These combinations, or this combination will guarantee electoral success in the future, and I'm afraid it is well known not only by political scientists, but a lot of political leaders, because they're practicing it without publishing anything on the topic. So, if you want to have a good look what this kind of conservative populism looks like, please go back to the International Conference of European National Conservatives, as they call themselves, that was held in Rome in 2020. You will find prime ministers, like the Prime Minister of Hungary there, the leader of the French opposition, you will find a lot of Dutch politicians, and all these people have one thing in common. They talk about common European values, and they talk against the European Union. So, they can say something that really shocks a lot of people who are unprepared. They can say, we love European culture and European heritage, we hate European Union. So get ready, this is going to be the next political debate, because usually people conflate these things. They coincide in the minds of a lot of people. European Union exists to defend European values. No, actually European Union destroys European values. It breaks the continuity with the tradition. So this hostility towards the European Union is actually a denial of the post-war process of European integration. And there is this general accusation against political intellectual elites that had caused the downfall of this exceptional European civilization. And I heard for the first time, or you can read about for the first time, if you haven't heard that concept of oikophobia. Forget about the word. Look what is behind oikophobia. This is loathing of one's native culture. This is a pathology characteristic for pro-European liberal elites, according to the populist conservatives. So, for conservative populists, culture and heritage play the role that glue the people together, but in a way that actually entails behind this anti-elitism, anti-intellectualism, and anti-establishment positions. So it is based on celebration of traditional values connected with religion, of course, and past history. So I'm afraid that democracy, of course, is resilient, but also this brand of conservative populism seems very resilient to me. And perhaps one of the future tasks is how to prepare, or is it possible to counterattack with a conservative defense of European Union? And just one paragraph as a beginning to this conservative defense of the European Union. If it is going to be a conservative defense, it has to be based in tradition, in some understanding of history. So I believe that we should start talking about or preparing for something that actually is not new, but of course forgotten. We should revive the foundational narrative of the European Union. European Union as rising from the ashes of World War 1 and 2, we have to revive the telos of progressive movement from war to peace. The idea of Europe as the product of memory, work, and as guarantee that the errors of the past will not be repeated. It should enshrine in many recent cultural policies implemented by the EU that should promote a shared European memory and identity. It should be the dominant paradigm that is grounded in remembrance, but in the remembrance to overcome and not to repeat the mistakes of the past. We have to know that conservative populism turns that model upside down in the service of a different or the opposite political agenda. Memory and cultural heritage should be used again, not to divide and exclude as conservative populists do, but memory and cultural heritage should be used to include and unite. And this is something that we should start doing, because the opposite discourse or the liberal discourse maybe is not as efficient as we all hope to be. And I just found something that can be a very good beginning of this new defense. There is a famous quote that I have heard so many times by so many people that probably don't know that it is a quote by Hegel. So I quote Hegel for the first time maybe in this room. What experience and history teach is this, that nations and governments have never learned anything from history or acted upon any lessons they might have drawn from it. Well, this is wrong. And I cannot think of a better proof that this is wrong than the very existence of the European Union. I think this is how the conservative defense of European Union should start. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Professor Malinov. As you see, Professor Malinov has huge political experience as well. So he's offering not only problems, but already solutions to those problems. So now we get into the second part of our discussion. I'll ask the participants some extremely complex questions to which I ask you to give very concise and short answers. And then we'll open the discussion to the public. I'll start. I'll start with a question to Professor Belov. I was struck by your depiction of the crisis of the 1930s. So you said that these were simpler crises than what we have now. In essence, liberal democracy had to deal with very sharp and extreme, but more simplistic challenges than it faces now. Actually, I wonder whether the challenges that liberal democracy went through were that simple. So look at the Great Depression, look at the rise of totalitarianism at the 1930s, the famine in Europe after the Second World War, well, the challenges of European integration and so on and so forth. These don't look to me simple challenges that what we have now, whatever it is. So my counter question is, and this is actually something that Professor Malinov also said, that politics is always facing some sort of crisis. So you cannot have a period without crisis whatsoever. And to me, it's well, this weighing of the different crises, that now we face something more dramatic than what we had, let's say, in the 1930s, may be the product of political entrepreneurs who say, look, the situation is so dramatic that unless we dismantle the system as a whole, it cannot be solved. This is a party strategy. And to me, the question is, to what extent this is a supply-side phenomenon produced by politicians who want to benefit from it, and they benefit from over-dramatizing problems which could be solved in one way or another. And well, compared to the 1930s, actually, we don't have hyperinflation. We don't have all these terrible ills that brought democracy at the moment. We do have the war in Ukraine, I should admit, and we didn't speak much about it, but maybe that's the point where we can bring it into the discussion. So please.
Yeah, thank you very much for that question, because it gives me the opportunity to really emphasize the complexity of the current situation. I strongly believe that the situation is totally incomparable, and the crisis of the 30s of the interwar period was rather unidimensional in comparison to what happens now. And the reason is, if you want to make the very long story short, the reason is that at the moment the problem is not just institutional or on the supply side, as you say. It's not just a clash of ideologies, some of which were actually transplanted all over Europe. It suffices to call the Austro-fascists, Schuschnigg and Dollfuss, who, when they ascended to power, they said, let's stop with these experiments with liberal democracy. They are maybe good for Britain, but they are not customized to our local context, something which actually Orban said in his speech about the liberal democracy, and something which even Napoleon III, when he ascended to power, said, let's stop with the experiments, let's go back to the great ideas of the emperor, you know. But I don't think it's the problem at the moment is that we have new Napoleon III's or Schuschnigg and Dollfuss. Of course, that's a problem, but that's a micro or meso problem. The big problems are that we have several game changers. They're objective and non-reversible. Globalization, technological revolution, the world has become world. We are facing also postmodernity. Many people would like to speculate about postmodernity in an academic way, speaking about the construction and stuff like that. But actually, we really have the problem how to order constitutional orders, because nationalism is as a form of constitutional geometric patchwork is non-applicable to the complexity of the current world society, but also we clearly witness the dysfunctionalities of globalization as it was ongoing in the last 30 years. And now we witness also experiments with new regionalism, which are quite painful, I would say. We witness how the square territoriality of our contemporary societies are suffering from the what I call, together with Manuel Castell's, spaces of flaws. And if you look at where the wars are led, these are the gray zones, the boundaries between the different new regions, and also where the space of flows are flowing. I'm not speaking only about Ukraine or Israel and the Middle East, but also look at sub-Saharan Africa. So I really think the problem is systemic, and I think we are entering a new civilization. It's not just a shift towards authoritarianism. It will be a brand new world. Whether it will be a brave new world, we shall see. We shall wait just a couple of years or decades, and we shall see.
Okay, so I move now to Mila. Oh, probably you wanted to say something on that, or yeah, okay. Mila, actually, I was wondering. I think it's very good for you to move at the European level and see how these processes of mainstreaming of radical issues play out there. I was wondering whether a distinction could be made between left-wing mainstream parties and right-wing mainstream parties. Which of these two are more vulnerable, let's say, to the adoption of radical messages from the far right? Because we have this curious paradox at our national level that left-wing party, which purports to be a mainstream left-wing party, actually has incorporated quite a lot of messages from the far right. So is there something that happening at the European level, or what are your reflections on the topic?
I would say yes, definitely no one is immune. Perhaps, and the problem that we mentioned earlier is this fashion of neglecting important issues. And when the mainstream parties in several Western European countries did this for a while, this opened the gap. Now, the truth is that on the European level, it's interesting because it's a combination between the East and the West, which is a division that is really fluid anyway, and it really depends how we look at it. But social democracy in Central and Eastern Europe has a completely different image and history, and in some countries doesn't even exist, and it's not represented parliamentary and in a party level. But then at the same time, it's quite nationalistic. So I think that these differences play out in the European Parliament as well, because in the group of the Social Democrats, we see more left-leaning and more actually nationalistic, right-leaning so-called socialist parties. So the first problem is that these struggles are internal for the political families, and they are to an extent where they cannot, I don't think they can filter them very easily, because these topics are now becoming sort of mainstream in the way that you have to have a position to be relevant for election. But we see very similar process in the center-right, both on the national and the European level, because in the European Parliament we have a more right-leaning fraction in the EPP and more, let's say, progressive, but very vaguely progressive to speak so. So I don't think anyone is immune, but the bigger problem I think is for the center-right, because in terms of the political spectrum, they're definitely closer to some of these issues that are brought from what I call the radical right. And just to go back to the definition, I think that if they challenge the constitutional separation of power and the rule of law as principles, this is somewhat of a radicalism when it comes to the resilience of democracy and its ability to sustain long term. So I would say no one is immune. The liberals are probably somewhere floating in the middle. Both, they also have a more social and more conservative wings, but hopefully they can at least play some sort of a balancing role in this battle. But I would say that the bigger problem is for the center right, because it's harder for them to ignore.
Yeah, and actually this fits with Zibwat's and his argument in how democracies die, that the center-right parties are more vulnerable. And my question to Professor Malinov, of course you can react to the discussion thus far, but my specific question to you is about this classical conservative response to the present crisis that you suggest. And you tie this to going back to the post-war period and somehow pointing out again the logic of the emergence of the European Union as a really good answer to the problem of securing peace in Europe and so on and so forth. But the problem with such movements back in time is that different groups, they choose a different period to turn back to. It's a little bit like in Georgy Gospodinov's time shelter novel. So some people would prefer this post-war European integration model, but some could go back to some other period, like the height of the Soviet Union or something like that as a reference point. So the choice of a reference point in a conservative turn is important, because some conservatives might not agree that what you suggest is the most attractive to them. So what would be your answer to such type of challenges?
Oh, well, there are two levels of answer. The one that I actually pleading to is the answer on the level of political fight, political struggle. And what I'm trying to explain is that we have to meet these people on the political arena. The other one is a scholarly level, which is very different. We can just point at the history to what this kind of understanding of the nation and of the homogeneity of peoples in Europe, to what it will lead. And we can just use examples from history. This understanding of Europe actually led to the two world wars, for me. And I'm not alone in that. Actually, this is what brought these clashes, because there is an iron logic behind this understanding, and the end, the military actually end of that logic. It's impossible to avoid, or it should just should not be radicalized and stop. But who will stop it? We have seen it twice. We see it now in Russia. You have to understand that the conservative discourse in Russia is 99% everywhere, and it is honest and it is sincere. It is not a kind of invented, or if it is invented, it has been invented at least 20, 25 years ago. So they accept that, and the logic of disunderstanding of the past really leads to war. It may sound oversimplistic, but I think it's not. So that's it. Of course, anyone can choose anything in that, but this is exactly what liberals will say. So we can say, well, they have the right to talk about that, and we have the right. No, we have the moral high ground because we're actually trying to overcome the mistakes of the past that this kind of conservatism has led to. And by the way, it also excludes part of European citizens because it is based on idea of values that is connected with Christianity, but it is a very simple concept. Christian values, it means that people who belong to the body of European Union are people who are Christians, and then there is no continuation of that logic. What about atheists? What about Muslims? Of course Muslims are excluded. This is the other thing that is common to all this. That's why actually there is no sense of solidarity in that respect. And of course this is anti-immigration background that probably will be quite popular, at least for some time. So that's it. You don't have this kind of answer that you're looking for. I accept that, but then what I see is that the conservative populists are quite far ahead with their political ideas, with their political points, while the others are actually hiding in the universities. They don't know how to react. And the politicians are left. It's going to be either this populist conservatism or liberal discourse. The liberal discourse will lose if left alone.
Okay, so we have temporarily lost one of our panelists. I hope everything's all right. But this gives me an opportunity to say that Milen raised an important point by bringing Syriza and Meloni's experience in Italy. Well, his idea was that the system is strong enough, institutionalized, that even some of the radical players, when they come to office, they kind of mainstream a little bit their message. So this is a reverse process to what was described by Mila in her presentation. So these dynamics are interesting. I just wanted to maybe ask a question or make a point about this issue, that some of the experience in Eastern European cases of like Orban and Kaczynski in Poland was the reverse, that coming to office they radicalized their message, and this made them quite successful. Actually, they managed to win elections after that. So this also should be taken into account, and it's more supportive of my theory of the radicalizing effects of well-entrenched and well-constitutionalized political systems. Okay, so we now open the floor for questions from the audience. Well, please, you've been patient so long. I hope that you have questions to ask to our panelists, please.
What do you think are there certain people groups in the European Union that are more vulnerable to populism? And if so, can you maybe elaborate on that? I would be very curious if you have an opinion, and that's Professor Belov. I believe you mentioned regionalism very earlier, but that's another thing. Yes, thank you.
I would like to come back to, thank you for the question actually. I would like to just come back to what Professor Smilov has said about inequality and the fact that inequality is not that decisive factor. I disagree with that, to be honest, because I'm not very well aware with the Czech or Slovak cases, but with the most of the other countries. The inequality is absolutely visible. Bulgaria is a strong example. Bulgaria has always been a very equal society in the Ottoman period, even in the monarchy period, in communism for sure, and the last 30 years are a huge exception from this egalitarian tradition. If you go to Romania, there are parts of the country where you are just crossing not a border, but you're jumping into space. There is a kind of space-time jump into the future or the past, and that's true for many other countries. So inequalities are rising not only in the East, also in the West, and you can visibly see that there is a not only intuitive but also sociological, parallelism between the fact that certain populations are prone to populism because they have been left behind, and others which were drawn into the future. And that's true also for America, and that's true also for the UK. I remember this great Monty Python movie when there was a picture from a rather grey place, and it was written a third world country, and then Yorkshire popped up, So if you look also in Germany or UK or USA, you can see this raising inequality, which is hugely detrimental to the maintenance and resilience of democracy, because actually the welfare state after World War II was created to a great extent through political engineering and through political consensus in order to be able to create the socio-legal preconditions for democracy, right? Which didn't exist before and which are being dismantled at the moment. So I'm increasingly pessimistic about democracy also because of the dismantling, also objective crisis of welfare state due to obvious economic and demographic and other problems that I don't have the time to discuss.
Well, this is really a complex debate. I did say that socioeconomic explanations, they do have force, and they explain certain cases. They are less powerful in other cases. So we have to discriminate really on this issue. But one point which puzzles me is that if inequality was the driving force behind the rise of populism and so on, and if the dismantling of the welfare state, or at least the pressure on the welfare state, was also the primary explanation of what is happening, then we would have to expect some sort of return of support to classical social democratic policy. And we don't see this anywhere. Actually, if there has been someone who has lost from this, it's the social democratic parties, and that's paradoxical. And of course, some people might say that populists like Trump and so on, they try to serve as a substitute of this, but at the policy level, they're exactly the opposite. So the welfare state is built on high taxes and different policies of public services and so on and so forth. And Trump is offering the opposite, actually dismantling Obamacare and lowering taxes and so on. So these puzzles explain, to me, they point out that there are more complex factors that are driving this type of political response. And inequalities and socioeconomic factors, they do play a role, but not in the way that a classical social democrat would expect that they would go. Yeah.
Well, I just want to make a historical analogy. Analogies are inevitable, dangerous, but inevitable. But it has already happened in times of crisis and so on. Everything looks like settled for resurgence or triumph of the left forces. And then something else comes and steals away the red apple of triumph for socialists. In Italy, this is the drama of Antonio Gramsci, the leader of the Communist Party. Everything is ready for the rise of the communists or the leftists, and suddenly someone else comes and steals it, and it's Mussolini. And it's the same today. Everything is in favor after this globalization's critiques and the liberal elite. Everything is in favor of the left forces, but suddenly, again, something else is stealing what they actually deserve. And this, again, is, as I call them, conservative populists. This will always, and this is a very interesting play of words, nationalism and conservative populism will always trump the left forces. Always. It's quicker, it's more flexible, it's easier, and that's what we see. That's what I believe. Everyone was expecting a big surge in the left forces after this consensus between Christian Democrats and Social Democrats. Now it's Social Democrats' turn. No, it was not Social Democrats' turn. It was the turn of the nationalist populist parties. And it's going to happen the same again. But that's a long story, but please pay attention to the facts.
Just short addendum. First, I don't think that these cleavages are the main factor, right? But they're definitely contributing, and that's visible. But what I would like to say here is that here is the imaginary dimension that matters. Because actually, indeed, you expect that many of the problems of the welfare state will produce a huge left or radical left wave. For example, the financial crisis was a great example. And actually, it was the rise of the extreme right, which we witnessed. Why? Because of the fact that when the people feel scared, when they feel frustrated, they go back to secure identities. And I would say that I'm speculating a little bit. I'm not absolutely sure whether it's true, but it seems that actually the secure identity of the West was nationalism, whereas the secure identity of the East was religious fundamentalism, and both were reinvented. So it's not a traditional nationalism or traditional fundamentalism. It was this invented tradition of radical religious belongingness. For example, not only in Islamic countries, but also in Russia, right? This orthodox imperial thinking. And also in the West, it was nationalism. Why? Because the people, you know, the social ideas are too diffuse, too mainstream, and too hard to grasp, whereas these secure identities have been practiced, and they're kind of deeply entrenched in the anthropology, political and constitutional anthropology of the people.
If you want to, well, famous words. Yeah. Okay, in this case, if there are no further questions, I'm going to close the discussion. Thank you again for attending it. I hope that the issues that we raised will have some interest. And so if you are interested in specific researches of the members of the groups, please do not hesitate to address us. The results of this research are going to be published anyhow, so some of the colleagues indicated where, when, and so on, but this will be updated regularly on the site of the project, so all these logistics are there. And let me end with an appreciation, actually, of this project summit, which was made possible with the help of the European Union and its Recovery and Resilience Fund, which was a great demonstration of something that Professor Malinov was talking about, that in times of crisis, actually the European Union managed to reform its institutions and almost to double its budget. So so I want to end on a positive note that a crisis sometimes could be an opportunity for amendments and for strengthening democratic institutions. We explored more the negative sides and the challenges and the problems, but this doesn't mean that there haven't been achievements even during challenging times. So thank you very much, and well, welcome to, we have a small reception or something here. Thanks. Проектът Самит всъщност е проект на Софийския университет, финансиран от Фонда за възстановяване и устойчивост на Европейския съюз. Нашата част е всъщност свързана с изследване на европейските ценности и как те са институционализирани в България и изобщо в европейските демокрации. Аз водя една от работните групи в този проект и тази работна група се занимава с устойчивостта на демокрацията. Това, което беше представено тук пред колегите, бяха резултатите от нашата работна група и работната група на професор Белов от юридическия факултет, който се занимава с понятието за конституционна поликриза. Ние направихме такава комбинация, защото до голяма степен въпросите, с които се занимаваме, се препокриват, просто перспективите са различни. Едната е по-конституционно правна, другата е по-политологическа. И на практика на нашия панел ние искахме да видим какво възпрепятства интернализирането на европейските ценности в България и в Източна Европа по-специално и по-широко разбирано. Това са процеси, които не са характерни само за Източна Европа като регион, дори в утвърдени западни демокрации, като демокрациите от Западна Европа, на практика има сходни процеси, така че на нашия панел и в нашето изследване ние разглеждаме различни отговори на този въпрос, какво възпрепятства и какво води до ерозия на практика на европейски ценности. Под европейски ценности тук разбираме най-вече демокрацията и конституционализма. Един от парадоксите е, че въпреки така успешното трансплантиране в България и в Източна Европа на модели от утвърдени демокрации, от началото на новия век започнаха процеси, някои ги наричат връщане назад, други възход на популизма, на радикални партии и така нататък, които показват, че има проблеми в това отношение. Нашия проект и панела, резултатите, които показахме, всъщност изследват какви са причините за всичко това, какви са възможните обяснения.
Добре, а каква е вашата мотивация да се включите като цяло в този проект?
Мотивацията ми е първо, че тя дава възможност на Софийския университет да участва в множество международни събития, просто ние да контактуваме, така да се каже, равнопоставено с нашите колеги от чужбина, да ходим на конференции, да представяме резултатите от това, което правим, да участваме в общи публикации. Това в средносрочен и дългосрочен план ще вдигне сериозно и качеството, пък и рейтинга на Софийския университет, защото публикациите са един от индикаторите, по които изоставаме спрямо други водещи университети. Това е едното. Другото е, че това са проекти, които дават възможност на човек да разгърне собствените си изследователски интереси, подпомагат ги. И също така дава и по-голям отзвук, дава възможности за публичност, за публикуване на това, което така или иначе правим. И като цяло това е възможност за създаване на академични мрежи с колеги от чужбина, които всъщност са начина, по който академичната общност функционира. Никъде, особено пък в нашите дисциплини като политически науки, не може да имате абсолютно изолирана и такава автохтонна школа, която не комуникира с останалите. Повечето от изследванията са и сравнителни и такъв тип проекти на практика ни дават възможност да засилим и академичната част, да подобрим качеството на академичната ни работа. И това също е добре и за студентите, защото пък те получават възможност да видят и хора от други университети, които идват, участват на събития. Сега след обед колеги от Великобритания, от други места ще изнасят техни резултати. Те са част от работните групи, в които сме създали. Всичко това ми се струва, че ще е полезно за университета. И се надявам такъв тип проекти да не останат просто един от ефектите на този фонд за възстановяване и устойчивост на Европейския съюз. Това е много добро начало, но това трябва да бъде направено устойчиво във времето, защото за да имаме добри изследователски университети, трябва да има и финансиране на изследователската дейност.
Здравейте, аз съм професор Мартин Белов, заместник декан на юридическия факултет на Софийския университет и един от водещите изследователи в проекта Европейски ценности и социални предизвикателства, ръководен от професор Стоичева. Аз имам един от страндовете, една от групите дейности в този проект и мога да ви кажа накратко с какво всъщност се занимаваме. Значи в рамките на моята част от проекта организирам 3 големи международни конференции. Първата се състоя през март. Тя беше посветена на кризата на представителна демокрация и потенциални рискове от настоящето и бъдещето пред нея. През есента ще направим още една конференция. Тя е посветена на конституционните въображаеми, на страха и кризата и също така следващата година ще има още една конференция. Наред с това, разбира се, от конференцията излязат конферентни сборници и също така организирам 2 лекционни поредици. Едната се казва Emergency Constitutionalism and Constitutional Polycrisis and Their Effects on Rule of Law and Democracy. Значи темата е общо взето за кризите и конституционализма на извънредното положение, тяхното негативно влияние върху съвременните конституционни системи. И втората лекционна поредица се казва Constitutional Imaginaries или конституционни въображаеми и даже днес има една от поредните лекции от нея, така че по този проект успяваме да привлечем водещи изследователи от цяла Европа и от цял свят, колеги от водещи университети от Италия, от Нидерландия, от Германия и от много други страни. И също така правим една обща за всичките потоци на този проект на поредица, Conversation Series или такива дискурси научни, в рамките на което, например, направихме една дискусия с доктор Саша Хард от Маастрихтския университет, отново за бъдещето на представителната демокрация.
Добре, какви са основните резултати до този момент и какви очаквате да бъдат в бъдеще по този проект?
Аз мога да говоря по-скоро за моята част от проекта, тъй като това е един много голям и комплексен и сложен проект. В моята част, наред с организираните вече 5 публични лекции, 3 от едната поредица и 2 от другата, наред с организираната конференция, в момента подготвям специален брой на едно много престижно европейско списание, издавано от университета в Грац, Австрия и от Брил, което ще включи 8 статии. То е посветено на конституционните преходи, конституционните традиции от гледна точка на конституционните въображаеми. И също така се подготвя за печат в водещо световно издателство, британско, книгата от тази конференция, посветена на представителната демокрация.